Hey, good morning, everyone. It's Thursday. This is AP Live with AP European History. Sun's shining here in Minneapolis, coming through the window. It's going to be a good day. My name is Todd Beach. I teach at Eastview High School in Apple Valley, Minnesota. And this is Katie.
Good morning. I'm Katie Lancey. I teach at Coral Gables Senior High in Coral Gables, Florida. It's a suburb of Miami. Sun is shining here too, and I think it's a lot hotter than where Todd is today, but we're excited to be here with you this morning. So today, if you can see, we have our Thursday. We are getting into absolutism and mercantilism throughout Europe. We also want to cue you to tomorrow, where we're going to do yet another full DBQ practice for you to practice the skills that are going to be on this year's AP exam, something we've done here for the last couple of weeks. So our lesson overview today, we're doing economic development of mercantilism, talking about the balance of power and the absolutist approaches to power, and then a comparison as we go through the different types of absolute governments that are going to emerge in different countries in Europe. And you can obviously pause the video and read this on your own to understand today's learning objectives and the skills and reasoning developments we're going to get into today. So feel free to pause if you want to read. We're going to keep going.
Okay, today's warm-up. So yesterday we left you with this. I really wanted you to do some comparison and looking at claims and evidence and sources. And so we had talked yesterday about constitutionalism, and today we're going to talk about absolutism. And so it seemed like this would be a good activity to compare the arguments of the main ideas of two different sources. And so when we approached an activity like this, the first thing we mentioned to do is that you should read the source line. So I'm reading this. It's King William III of England, a declaration. What do I already know right now? I'm going to pull from my own memory. What do I already know about William III, William and Mary of England? And what do I know as it relates to governing? And then source B is Frederick William the Great, Elector of Prussia, letter to his son Frederick I, first King of Prussia. And again, I should draw on my knowledge. What do I already know about what happened in Prussia as far as terms of governing? And so our homework is to describe the main idea in source A as it relates to governing, describe the main idea as it relates to in source B as it relates to governing, and then C is just what's the difference between the two sources. So we had lots of entries come in yesterday, and some even come in this morning, and so we can go through some of those. The first one was from Catherine of Pulaski County High School in Kentucky. Really nice job. In source A, believes strong constitutional monarchy, perfect, and tells us what that is. Source B, advises son to limit activities that would limit his power over the country. Yes, absolutely. And then this comparison, the comparison. Frederick William I of Prussia, King William III of England, gives himself much less power than what he has given. He does this by giving Parliament more power than they previously had and ensuring that it maintained a free and lawful environment for the British. On the other hand, Frederick William of Prussia gave himself as much power as he could by limiting the amount of parliaments he held. This difference shows the priorities of each king. So that's a really nice response, Catherine from Pulaski County High School in Kentucky. This one from Carolyn, and she is at Mountain View High School in Virginia. The main idea in source A as it relates to governing is, first of all, I love that, right? We're using the stem of the prompt to respond to the prompt. Is that Parliament should be free to determine the best decisions for the country. King and Parliament exist under the same purpose of preserving Protestantism and guaranteeing rights for their nation's citizens. Absolutely. Source B, the main idea is, as it relates to governing, Parliament should be kept limited and heavily regulated for a free Parliament and would reduce the power of the king. Yes. And then C, one difference between the main ideas of the two sources is, really good job again, Carolyn, of just putting the stem of the prompt right there, is the extent of power the authors believe Parliament should hold. While source A, and hey, by the way, some of you did this and you stopped right there. Some of you just said this is the extent of the authors believe and something to that effect, and then you stopped. But here's the thing. In C, you were asked to explain, not just describe. So that's a higher level, and we have to give us the how, why, or because, not just state what it is, but how, why, or because. while source A supports a free parliament, arguing both the king and parliament simply want what is best for the country and uphold some belief system, source B supports a limited parliament, arguing that the power of the king must not be limited by increasing the power of parliaments. So yes, Carolyn, Mountain View High School, Virginia, very well done. This is from Estelle at Godwin High School, also in Virginia. Main ideas governing source A, reliance on parliament. Main ideas of governing in source B is the ruler to try and obtain as much power as possible. Yes. And then C, one difference between the main ideas of governing between the two sources is reliance on parliaments or other bodies that hold power. And again, some of you stopped right there, but I'm going to tell you that if it tells you to explain, we have to go further. And so Estelle says in source A, the monarch receives power under the observation of parliament, works with parliament. Source B, rulers should hold parliaments as less as possible as parliaments take authority from the ruler. The ruler should not rely on parliaments or even hold parliaments if not necessary. So Estelle, really well done. One more, because this was so good. I'm just going to do part C. Grace at Benjamin N. Cardozo High School in Queens, New York. One difference from the two sources as it relates to governing is source A supports the partnership while source B is against it. Again, some of you stopped there, but Grace goes further. It states, and then she gives us the quote, source A, King William III of England depicts in source A how the monarch will establish a stable trust with Parliament by letting them regulate and create laws. Contrary to source A, Frederick William warns King Frederick I of Prussia to handle political matters on his own because they viewed Parliament to be deceptive and greedy for more power. Therefore, the rulers of Prussia refused to develop a trust with Parliament in fear the estates would diminish the power of the monarchy. Really well explained, Grace. That's a great response. So I hope that was helpful for everybody. We want to make sure that we're, first of all, paying attention to the task word. Describe or explain or evaluate, whatever our task word is, tells us how we have to handle that exercise. And then we want to make sure if it's explain or evaluate, we want to get into that how, why, because, that deeper analysis. Really well done, you guys. So what do you think of these samples? Was this helpful today? So on our Twitter account at Learning Euro, I put up a poll this morning because we want some feedback. We've been paying attention to those, trying to see that the samples we're giving are helping you learn. So please, if you are on Twitter, go to at Learning Euro and give us a result of how the samples worked for you. All right, we're going to get into our learning this morning, and this is Katie.
That's great, Todd. I also want to say before we start that I think it's so great that even though that's not the task that kids are going to see on the exam in May, looking at these sources and looking at their arguments and understanding how the arguments are similar or, in the case of today, different, is really going to be key to using those documents as evidence in the DBQ. So that was that's a really nice exercise. So we are going to contrast what we talked about in England and talk about absolutism. We're going to start in our sort of our poster child there on the right for absolute monarchy with Louis XIV. To give a little bit of background, prior to Louis XIV, we have Cardinal Richelieu, and he is the minister of the crown on behalf of Louis XIII. And he is going to start this policy of strengthening and centralizing authority in the hands of the monarchy in France. He will initially start to suppress Protestantism, and he's going to extend the use of the intendant system. And these are officials appointed by the monarch. They are loyal and report only to the king. They are sort of the eyes and ears of the king throughout the country, and they administer local laws. So when Louis XIV becomes king at the age of 4, he needs to have a regent who will act as his mother will act as regent, along with Cardinal Mazarin. And he is really going to continue Richelieu's policies of centralizing the power of the monarchy. This is going to lead to some problems and this series of rebellions known as the Fronde. And this is going to play a central role in Louis's desire to keep the nobles under control throughout the length of his reign. So when Mazarin dies, Louis will assume the throne and absolutism will reach its peak under Louis XIV. We will see that he believes very much, like we talked about yesterday with the Stuart monarchs, he believes in the divine right of kings, and he's going to acquire the title the Sun King. This comes after his performance in a ballet where he's dressed as the sun. And this will kind of show his belief that he is the central person in this divine order of things. There is a legislative body in France, the Estates General down in D, and Louis never calls this Estates General during his reign. And he's going to revoke, if you remember, we spoke about Henry IV's Edict of Nantes, and that was actually one of the documents in the DBQ that you practiced on last Friday. And he will take that back. He will revoke that. And he will demand that Huguenots renounce their faith. He calls for the destruction of Huguenot churches. And because of this, we're going to see over 200,000 Huguenots, many of them who are very skilled artisans, will flee France. If you want to go to the next slide. So here on the right, I have just a couple. There are so many amazing images. And if you wanted to see more, you could certainly do something similar to what I suggested yesterday and Google images of Versailles. But Versailles is sort of going to be the symbol of Louis XIV's absolutism. He will move the government away from the city of Paris in 1682 into the renovated hunting lodge that he has renovated in all of this splendor that you see in some of these pictures. The top picture is the Hall of Mirrors. And he's going to require the nobility to reside at Versailles and compete for his favor. To do this, in B, you're going to see he establishes this elaborate set of rituals, and they encompass the entirety of the day. The waking of the king, the dressing of the king's meals, retiring for bed, all of these are going to require the nobility to wait on him, and that is the way the nobles are able to have access to him. It's the way they're able to get his ear and then hopefully get his favor. So this is a really important part of culture that brings the nobility into living at Versailles, and basically their entire day is waiting on the king, which means the king knows what they're up to, and he's not worried about rebellions because they're there actually waiting on him, day and night. Versailles, because of this, really becomes the center of European politics and French culture. It will grow in international prestige. We will see French replace Latin as the language of scholarship and learning, and French has definitely become the language of diplomacy. And then in D, all of this is accomplished because the economy is flourishing. In large part, the Minister of Finance, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, he's a financial genius, and he believes the economy should serve the state. And he's very much someone who's going to implement the policies of mercantilism in France. So let's go to the next slide and we'll kind of go over what some of those policies are. So the crux of mercantilism is to have a favorable balance of trade that allows a country to export more than it imports so that we will have an accumulation of wealth, right? And so that's Colbert, the picture on the left. He will enact policies to ensure that they have this favorable balance of trade. And because of this, during his tenure, France's industrial output will grow very steadily. And so some of the things that he does that are very typical of a mercantilist economy, he's going to make sure that France is self-sufficient. So here in 1, he's going to insist that France produce the items for domestic consumption to limit purchases abroad. He wants the French to be able to produce and, of course, grow in terms of food, everything that France is going to need to be self-sufficient. And self-sufficiency is a really important part of this. In 2, he's going to really support industries for export, right? We want products going out, and because of that, we want gold coming in. We want money coming in and staying in France. He's going to create very strict manufacturing codes to ensure quality, and he will encourage skilled craftsmen to come to France. And so all of that is to hope that the French products are really valued throughout the world and that France is self-sufficient. In 3, he's going to abolish domestic tariffs, and he'll raise tariffs on foreign goods to make French goods affordable and foreign ones more expensive. So all of this is sort of the ideas of mercantilism. We want to import as little as possible. We want to export as much as we can to get that wealth flowing into the country. And Colbert is really the master at accomplishing that during his tenure as a financial minister under Louis XIV.
Great, thank you, Katie. So I just want to take a moment too to remind everybody that we are reviewing content, not teaching new content. Right. So there's a lot about France and about Louis. And so she did a great job of kind of just keeping it to 3 slides. But what happens if you're thinking, gosh, this doesn't seem so familiar? What could you do? You can go back into that textbook and start reading back again, because that was probably something you covered a few months ago, and bring that memory back. So this is review, and that's really a great job to kind of condense it like that. So on the opposite of France, we have Spain. So in the last century, Spain was on the rise, Ferdinand and Isabella, but now Spanish absolutism, which happened before that of the French in the 1500s in the Kingdom of Castile, they developed these characteristics of absolute monarchy, and then everybody takes kind of on their own flavor of that. But what's going to happen in the 17th century for Spain? So between 1610 and 1650, Spanish trade with the colonies in the New World fell 60% due to competition, because the Dutch, as we talked about yesterday, becomes their golden age. England is trading like crazy. And so that kind of competition really cuts in on the Spanish competition. Now, gold and silver from the Americas were the basis for Spanish power in the 1500s for sure. Ultimately, a lot of those mines that filled the empire's treasury start to run dry. There's also this idea that there was probably some corruption taking place and many people putting things in their pocket rather than getting them back to the state. The crown repeatedly then devalues the coinage, declares bankruptcy repeatedly. And that results in a collapse of national credit. So if you owe money to people and you declare bankruptcy, but if you keep doing this over and over again, it's going to be very difficult for you to get credit with anyone else ever again, because you've established a habit of not paying your debts. So the other thing that's going on, just think socially, right? Socially, they don't have much of a middle class. Part of this is because the expulsion of Moors and Jews. They face an agricultural crisis. There's a bit of a population decline. Some of that is because we have people leaving Spain to go to the New World to kind of strike their fortune. We also are dealing with state governments that don't really invest in productive enterprises, meant that by 1715, Spain becomes kind of a second-rate power. So we're seeing trade decline. We're seeing that real big source of income was trade and then gold and silver. And we're seeing all that kind of run out, but we aren't seeing great leadership work around that. We're not seeing it try to take on these challenges and make changes. Spain itself during the century is involved in a number of wars it cannot afford. The monarchy spends far more than it can afford. And one of the big conflicts are these Franco-Spanish wars, these conflicts with the French. They cost Spain many colonial possessions in the end. There's peace that's finally reached with the Treaty of the Pyrenees in 1659. And the source I've given you on right is part of the 30 Years' War, the Battle of Rocroi. And the Spanish are defeated by the French as part of the 30 Years' War. But there were a number of these other battles that were taking place, which finally get settled in 1659 and don't result in a positive way necessarily for Spain, other than war is done. Okay.
That's
Katie?
great. And you got a lot into one slide also. So I want to take a look at a source here today for our activity, and I'm going to bring us back to this at the end of the lesson with our homework. This is from an old DBQ that was on an alternate form of the exam, but it's since been released. And the prompt from that DBQ was, evaluate whether or not absolute monarchy accurately describes the rule of Louis XIV. And so this particular source is a portrait of Louis XIV sitting on the throne of the supreme Roman god Jupiter. And it's commemorating that defeat of that noble rebellion, the Fronde, and it's displayed at the Palace of Versailles. And then at the bottom, you can see the translation of the Latin. It says, Jupiter, applauding Louis, ceases his thundering, and now the world sees that a new Jupiter has arrived. So this is such a pro-Louis XIV power visual here. And I wanted to take a minute for you guys to look at this and think about, if you were maybe going to source this, how you would use it. I think if you were going to use it to answer the prompt, it'd be pretty clear that this is showing that he is an absolute monarch by comparing him to, the king of the gods. And it's such a rich visual that I wanted just to take a minute and look at how the argument here would absolutely support the prompt being that he was an absolute monarch. And then for homework, I'm going to have you look at another document from the same DBQ that has a bit of a different look at Louis and how you might source that document as well. But I wanted to start by just giving you this rich visual of basically the god, Louis XIV, as how certainly he thought of himself when we talk about his belief in the divine right of kings. And that really does sort of exemplify what many of these absolute rulers thought. So just giving you this look at this rich visual to think about, and then possibly to compare it at the end with the homework if you choose to do that. Great.
Great. It's a good activity because we know there's going to be a visual on the DBQ and the one you're going to see tomorrow as well. All right, back into our content. Let's go east now and look at absolutism in Austria. And I'm just going to give a bit of contextualization before I dive into the Austrian Habsburgs. So, and this is a bit of a generalization, but I think it will hold. I think it's something that'll help you. 17th century is a struggle between absolutism and constitutionalism. In Eastern Europe, however, absolutism definitely wins the struggle. But what we have to look at is how Eastern Europe absolutism differs from what we see in the West, what Katie just talked about, especially with France. So Prussia, Russia, Austria emerge as absolutist powers. They're going to stay that way until the end of World War I. So that's quite a long time. They're created from the Ottoman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, and from Poland. So East versus West, this is about circa 1650. East, the nobles are very powerful. And then in the West, as Katie just described with France, Louis puts limits on the power of the nobility. He makes them come to Versailles, wait on me, put you in your place. In the East, we have a weak middle class. In the West, part of this is because of Colbert and Richelieu. We have a strong middle class, a really strong manufacturing and artisan sector. And then in the East, oppressed peasantry and serfs. And in the West, the peasants are generally free. So this kind of T-chart, back and forth is a good way to kind of see the differences between these two. It doesn't mean to say that neither is absolutist. They're very absolutist. So I don't want you to look at the nobility piece and go, well, they're not as strong, okay? The Austrian Habsburgs absolutism develops. Prussia's absolutism is going to be stronger and more effective. And how are they going to monopolize power? If you're going to be an absolute monarch, you have to monopolize power. And how do you get that? Permanent taxes levied without consent. We're not going to vote on it. They'll just be applied. Permanent standing armies. And of course, Katie, my joke is they never let them sit down. And then 3, conduct relations with foreign powers as they please. I'm not going to go ask the nobles what they think and send a diplomatic mission. So B, the consolidation of Habsburg control over 3 areas. The Kingdom of Bohemia. So that happened during the 30 Years' War. That was the first phase of the 30 Years' War, and the Habsburgs and the Catholics won that phase. And they will stamp out Protestantism. They'll take nobles' land. Serfdom is even worse. So we talked about oppression of the serfs. In an upper lower Austria, there are hereditary provinces that will belong to Habsburg control, or let's just say Habsburg control. And then the Kingdom of Hungary is less integrated. Part of this because there's the Ottoman Turks take on Vienna. There's a siege of Vienna in 1683. They sit outside the city walls for almost a year before Charles V finally raises an army to push them back. But the nobles are still rebellious the further east we go. Charles VI then will issue the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713, and that idea is to keep the Austrian Habsburg lands united in the event of his death. Take a look at Ferdinand III, this source, the Holy Roman Emperor, portrait of him, King of Hungary, King of Bohemia, and he helps to give that big piece of absolutist control under a Habsburg domain. I don't know, he's kind of got this laurel wreath on his head. That's quite an image, actually. So there you go, absolutism in Austria. Katie?
That's a great image. So I want to start off by talking about how sometimes I know students can be so frustrated keeping names straight. And certainly as we start in Prussia, this can be an instance of that. We did the in England yesterday with Charles James, and I know my students really struggle, and this is another place where they struggle. So we start off sort of contextualizing that Brandenburg Prussia, which will eventually just become Prussia, has a small population, but it has very powerful leadership in this family, the Hohenzollerns, and I always butcher that pronunciation. And it's very much an efficient family that uses its resources well, and it has this intense military tradition. And that military is going to be very closely tied with the power and the prestige. So we start off with Frederick William, and I jokingly said with Todd that my son is William Frederick because of all the German in our family. And he was the great elector. He took power in 1640, and he seeks to unify that territory of Brandenburg, Prussia, and other territory to create one unified state. And in order to do this, as Todd was just saying, he does not isolate the nobility or the Junkers. He actually garners their support. He grants them very high positions in the army. He gives them power over their serfs. We will see serfdom abolished later with another Frederick, but that's not part of today's lesson. And we will see that they will agree to a tax in return for this power that will be funneled into funding the military. And then we move to King Frederick William I. And he's really the person that we associate with consolidating absolutism. And that's him on the right there. He's known as the Soldier King. If you take a look at what he's known to almost always be in his military uniform. And he's known for his incredible efficiency and his deep, deep austerity. He was a penny pincher. He was totally okay using state funds to fund the military, and often his household estate was really absent because of that. He really spent the money on the country. So under these austere economic policies in D, we're going to see economic development flourish, and the army is going to grow into something that, despite its population, which is, I think 11th or 12th at the time, the army is just massively powerful, efficient, and envied. He will introduce merit advancement, which will allow middle class to rise, but that is not at the expense of the nobles. He allows them to be in positions of command. So this sets up a very militaristic society that clearly has the power in the king here that we're just starting to call King Frederick William I. And then later, when we get a little further into this time, we're going to talk about enlightened absolutism with Frederick William II, who we also call Frederick the Great. So that's coming in another lesson.
Thanks, Katie. Okay, so stay with us here because this is a lot, right? We had France on the rise, getting stronger, Spain in decline. We know from yesterday where the Dutch and the English are in their constitutional systems. We see the Habsburgs gaining control in Austria. We see the Hohenzollerns gaining control in Prussia. Now let's go to Russia. It's so much, I know, to kind of keep straight, but here we are. Let's start with this source. So that's Peter the Great right there. And I'm sure your teachers probably really enjoyed talking about Peter the Great. There's a lot of stories about him. He makes for rich narrative and conversation as far as history is concerned. But I had never seen this source until I was preparing for you for today. And so I was looking for a really good source. I didn't want the typical one that we always see in the textbooks. And I came across this one. So this is him in the center here. And he has this weapon here. And it shows how he has just beheaded one of the rebel Streltsy. So these are those musketeers that are semi-professional, paid for, that are supposed to be loyal to him. And he finds one that is not loyal. And it was somewhat rebellious. And through the secrets of spies and all that espionage, he gathers this little gathering and he beheads this man right in front of everyone else. So let's think about kind of what kind of an impression that's going to leave if you're a noble raising a toast in the image. Unreal image to start with. So we'll start with the Romanovs, the Romanov dynasty, 1613. The nobles elect Ivan. You may have read about Ivan the Terrible. The nobles are going to elect Ivan's 16-year-old grandnephew, Michael Romanov, as the new hereditary czar. His election proved to be the restoration of czarist autocracy. Prior to that time was the time of troubles when we weren't sure who was in charge in Russia. And that's going to eventually get us up to Peter the Great. Okay. And he is the person we talk about when we talk about these new absolutist monarchs. So how do we earn the title the Great? Well, we have to conquer. Territorial expansion. Peter is going to know only 1 year of peace in his 36 years of rule. And that's going to take about 80 to 85%, historians estimate, of state revenues during that time. Why that's significant is because it's really difficult to build infrastructure and make things better for everyone else if you're constantly war making. But he's going to manage to get some other reforms done as well. So in the war making, early defeats against Sweden, the Great Northern War. So he's defeated early. He reforms the military. They gain victories at Poltava. I think that's in 1709. And then a conclusive victory finally in 1721 against the Swedes, gaining Estonia, gaining Latvia. And so with these gains, we earn our moniker Peter the Great. A consequence of his war making is the influx of Western ideas into Russia. Perhaps your teacher talked to you about the stories of Peter as a teenager, going, quote unquote, incognito into the West, making visits. And I say incognito because he had like a train of people in coaches and bringing all of the extravagant things that a czar should bring, but saying, oh, I don't want this attention. But he learns about shipbuilding. He learns about all these Western ideas, and he's going to bring those ideas back to Russia. And the Western ideas come back to Russia and some Westerners, and a new class of educated Russians begin to emerge. He's going to construct a city. So Katie did a great job of showing us Versailles. And again, that's a great idea to go Google images of Versailles. And you can do something similar with St. Petersburg. So they're all these monarchs are kind of competing against each other. And so here we have Versailles going on, but Peter says, I'll just make a whole city after me. Kind of strikes ground at this area that's located on the Baltic Sea. They wanted a port city. It's really swampy. It's terrible land. And they have to create all these canals. Thousands of peasants will actually die in the building of St. Petersburg. But he gets his city by the sea. Many reforms were detested by the nobles. Peasants saw significant increases in their bonds of serfdom. So we think back to that T-chart I showed you, serfs in the East, even tighter bonds. And these nobles, they have strength, but not like the absolutist monarch that Peter's reforms create a more modern army and a state that was introduced to Western civilization. It's going to pave the way to move Russia closer to the European mainstream, especially as we get into Enlightenment, which we'll talk about early next week in the reign of Catherine the Great. Okay, that's our content lesson for today. There's a lot to keep track of, but again, we really kind of want your feedback. And there's a poll on the content part of the lesson at Learning Euro for Twitter. Just give us a quick bit of feedback and let us know what you think. We hope it was helpful. Okay, our key takeaways today, we wanted to talk about change. We want to talk about causes, talk about the absolutist form of rule. I'm hoping that when you were thinking about all the absolutist pieces we were giving you today, you were hearkening back to yesterday's comparison to constitutional forms of government. All right.
That's great. You've got so much in that one slide for Russia. My students always like that I'm angry he made the women wear high heels and stockings. Okay, so for homework today, this is a very busy slide, and I want to kind of talk you through it very quickly. I'm going to bring you back to sourcing as your main homework. This is the report of one of those intendants back to Colbert, the finance minister that we just spoke about. And I'm not going to read it to you. I want you to read it on your own and think about the prompt in the activity and what that says about whether or not he's truly an absolute monarch, Louis XIV. But for homework, I'd like you to keep practicing your sourcing. You guys are doing great at contextualization and thesis, but I definitely think practicing this and then comparing what you did to our samples is going to be a really helpful exercise for you to make sure you're doing it right. It is 2 out of the 10 points on the exam. And I want to just remind you that besides if you look at the top in our HAPPY acronym, reminding you that this is not the only acronym, but the one that we chose to use for these lessons, that is historical situation, audience, purpose, point of view. Please be sure to include that why or that explanation. Why does this matter? Why is it important? Why do we think about this in terms of looking at the document as evidence? So I'd like you to go ahead and do a sourcing and use some of those best practices that Todd spoke about when we did this last time, about using attribution to do your source, and to end with referencing the document with the parentheses at the end with the document. This was document 3 from that. If you want additional practice, you can look at the bottom and maybe think about how this compares with that pretty amazing visual in the activity, and try your hand at a thesis if you'd like to do that as well to the prompt that was on our activity page. And as you have been doing, if you email your responses to apeuro@gmail.com, we'll talk about some of the correct answers and really good examples of people who do this skill correctly tomorrow before we start our lesson.
Great, that'll be great practice. And again, just a reminder, we have the DBQ coming tomorrow that we'll release to you so that you can have that kind of practice as well. This quick notice from College Board: we know that not all students have access to the internet or device. We're working on solutions to help students get what they need to show their best work. If you need mobile tools or connectivity or know someone who does, reach out directly to College Board at cb.org/tech. Hey, and our shout outs today, this is so fun. I really kind of doing this because I find these different schools and I look them up on the internet. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so cool. So Hickory High School, Chesapeake, Virginia. You're the Hawks. Go Hawks. We see you guys. Indian Land High School in Lancaster County, South Carolina, the Warriors. And Roland High School at Roland Heights, California. Go Raiders. You guys got this. This has been a lot of fun to just kind of, when we read through your responses, like, oh my gosh, I'm so curious about that school. I wonder what it's like. And to look you guys up has been great fun for us anyway. Okay, Katie.
Right. It's been we continue to be so impressed at the work you're doing. And I really like that hashtag, you got this, because that's how I want my students to feel. They do. You've got this. We've got still time to practice. And I know everyone's going to be really successful when this DBQ comes out in May. So keep on practicing.
Thanks for watching. See you guys tomorrow. Bye-bye.